It is an unfortunate truth that more and more people, especially millennials and Z-Gen, are having difficulty reading books. I feel like that's something that people need to be taking personal responsibility on and fixing, but I'm also of the mind that those of us that want to deliver ideas to the world must be aware of this and meet people where we can. So, I am proposing a new tradition that I hope other women will follow, and that is comfortably dressed Radfem reading hour. If you have a decent enough microphone, just pick a text, give some context and history for it, and then read it aloud for everybody. Today, I'm going to be reading Chapter 4 of Janice Raymond's most famous book, The Transsexual Empire. Former Catholic nun Janice Raymond, from here on out, J-Ray, your Radfem BFF, left the Sisters of Mercy and became a lesbian feminist and a professor of women's studies and medical ethics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her history as a nun is often brought up to discredit her and paint the picture that she, and also former Catholic theologian turned lesbian feminist Mary Daly, are somehow in bed with the Catholic Church, and thus conservatism or something, casually forgetting that being a working class Catholic girl who wanted to avoid marriage to a man in the 50s and 60s might make religious life a fairly attractive option, a life both women jettisoned when they found lesbian feminism. A 2014 piece on transadvocate.com says that because one sentence she wrote was quoted in one part of a 3-part government report, which deduced the section that her sentence was quoted in, it deduced that in 1981, transsexual surgery was controversial, which should be a surprising conclusion to no one at all. But because she wrote that one sentence, she is responsible for the lack of health care trans people have received from that point forward. And the sentence that she wrote? It was, "Some have held that it would be preferable to modify society's sex role expectations of men and women than to modify either the body or the mind of individuals to fit these expectations." This bizarre article even goes so far as to suggest that in the 80s, Medicaid was covering surgeries for transsexuals, and that this report, for which J. Ray is personally responsible because of her one sentence, ended that coverage. Their proof that this was covered in the 80s was that somebody told somebody else that someone else's surgery was probably covered by Medicaid because no one else paid for it. It's a real act of narcissistic language twisting, and I'm sure the author feels really good about it, but we should move on. While most of the transsexual empire concerns the medical industrial complex surrounding transsexuality, this is the empire to which the title refers, and feminist analysis of the thoughts and experiences of the homosexual males who were the bulk of those transitioning during that time, this chapter concerns the small number, at the time, of transsexuals claiming to be lesbians. Published 40 years ago, in 1979, this text predates Ray Blanchard's coining of the word autogynephilia by 10 years, but still catches on to the obvious fetishistic motivations of self-styled lesbian transsexual women. Something that we should remember as we try to map things from the past onto today, while we're thinking about this text, is that according to the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey, only about 20% of self-identified trans women in the U.S. have actually had any kind of surgery on their bits, and half of those are merely oreectomies, removing the testicles alone. In J. Ray's day, as in Blanchard's, the only way a male identifying as a woman could even consider being accepted was by actually going through the full surgical process and turning a penis into something like a vagina. Today, obviously, things are very different. In a similar vein, some of J. Ray's literary choices have fallen out of style. A line that is often criticized by those who hate her book is, "All transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves." Where it was just 9 years ago that Lindy West wrote, "Sex in the City 2 takes everything that I hold dear as a woman and as a human and rapes it to death with a stiletto that costs more than my car," It was also just 7 years ago that Lindy apologized for it, saying, "I chose rape on purpose at the time because it's gendered and jarring and I wanted to convey the severity of my disgust as a woman with that fucking garbage movie. But if I wrote that review today, would I write it in the same way? Nope, I would probably write bludgeoned." The boundaries of what is considered okay and what is not okay to describe as rape have shifted since J. Ray's time, and clearly within just the last 10 years. The word she-male is also not doing so hot, as RuPaul can attest. Still, the Transsexual Empire is a good read, giving lots of insight into the early forms of this machine that would eventually come to rewrite laws and social norms concerning who is a woman, and even now who is female and entitled to female-only services and to play professional women's sports. So let's get to it. This is Karen with Actual Feminism, and this is Comfortably Dressed Radfem Reading Hour. Chapter 4, Sappho by Surgery, the Transsexually Constructed Lesbian Feminist. Transsexualism is multifaceted. From all that has been said thus far, it is clear that it raises many of the most complex questions feminism is asking about the origins and manifestations of sexism and sex role stereotyping. For a long time, I have been very hesitant about devoting a chapter of this book to what I call the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist. In the order this book was written, it was actually the last chapter I wrote. The recent debate and divisiveness that the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist has produced within feminist circles has convinced me that, while transsexually constructed lesbian feminists may be a small percentage of transsexuals, the issue needs an in-depth discussion among feminists. I write this chapter with the full realization that feminists look at the issue of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist from the vantage point of a small community in which transsexuals have been able to be very visible, not because there are that many of them, but because they immediately have center stage. Thus, focusing attention on this particular aspect of the transsexual issue may only serve to inflate the issue, and their presence all the more. It may also distract attention from the more central questions that transsexualism raises, and the power of the medical empire that creates transsexualism to begin with. Because the oral and written debate concerning the transsexually constructed lesbian feminists seems to be increasing out of proportion to their actual numbers, I think that feminists ought to consider seriously the amount of energy and space we wish to give to this discussion. However, if any space should be devoted to this issue, it is in a book that purports to be a feminist analysis of transsexualism. Furthermore, most of the commentary thus far has been limited to letters to the editor and editorial comments in feminist papers, as well as a few scattered articles in various journals. Because of limited space, these analyses are necessarily restricted. I would like, therefore, to provide an extensive and intensive analysis of the issue and to address the deeply mythic dimensions that the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist represents. While regarded by many as an obscure issue that affects a relatively minute proportion of the population, transsexualism poses very important feminist questions. Transsexually constructed lesbian feminists show yet another face of patriarchy. As the male-to-constructed female transsexual exhibits the attempt to possess women in a bodily sense while acting out the images into which men have molded women, the male-to-constructed female who claims to be a lesbian feminist attempts to possess women at a deeper level, this time under the guise of challenging rather than conforming to the role and behavior of stereotyped femininity. As patriarchy is neither monolithic nor one-dimensional, neither is transsexualism. All men and male-defined realities are not blatantly macho or masculinist. Many indeed are gentle, nurturing, feeling, and sensitive, which of course have been the more positive qualities that are associated with stereotypical femininity. In the same way that the so-called androgynous man assumes for himself the role of femininity, the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist assumes for himself the role and behavior of feminist. The androgynous man and the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist deceive women in much the same way, for they lure women into believing that they are truly one of us, this time not only in behavior, but one in spirit and conviction. It is not accidental that most male-to-constructed female transsexuals who claim to be feminists also claim to be lesbian feminists. In fact, I don't know of any transsexually constructed feminists who do not also claim to be lesbians. It is this combination that is extremely important. Lesbian feminists have spent a great deal of energy in attempting to communicate that the self-definition of lesbian informed by feminism is much more than just a sexual choice. It is a total perspective on life in a patriarchal society, representing a primal commitment to women on all levels of existence, and challenging the bulwark of a sexist society, that is, heterosexism. Thus, it is not a mere sexual alternative to men, which is characterized simply by sexually relating to women instead of men, but a way of being in the world that challenges the male possession of women at perhaps its most intimate and sensitive level. In assuming the identity of lesbian feminists, then, doesn't the transsexual renounce patriarchal definitions of selfhood and choose to fight sexism on a most fundamental level? First of all, the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist may have renounced femininity, but not masculinity and masculinist behavior, despite deceptive appearances. If, as I have noted earlier, femininity and masculinity are different sides of the same coin, thus making it quite understandable how one could flip from one to the other, then it is important to understand that the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist, while not exhibiting a feminine identity and role, still exhibits its averse side, stereotypical masculinity. Thus, the assumption that he has renounced patriarchal definitions of selfhood is dubious. Masculine behavior is notably obtrusive. It is significant that transsexually constructed lesbian feminists have inserted themselves into the positions of importance and/or performance in the feminist community. The controversy in the summer of 1977 surrounding Sandy Stone, the transsexual sound engineer for Olivia Records, an all-woman recording company, illustrates this well. Stone is not only crucial to the Olivia enterprise, but plays a very dominant role there. The national reputation and visibility he achieved in the aftermath of the Olivia controversy is comparable in feminist circles to that attained by Renee Richards in the wake of the Tennis Week Open. This only serves to enhance his previously dominant role and to divide women, as men frequently do, when they make their presence necessary and vital to women. Having produced such divisiveness, one would think that if Stone's commitment to and identification with women were genuinely woman-centered, he would have removed himself from Olivia and assumed some responsibility for the divisiveness. In Boston, a transsexual named Christy Barsky has worked himself into a similar dominant position, this time coaching a women's softball team, coordinating a conference on women and violence, staffing a women's center, and performing musically at various all-women's places. Thus, like Stone, he exhibits a high degree of visibility and also divides women in the name of lesbian feminism. Pat Hines has suggested that there is only an apparent similarity between a strong lesbian, woman-identified self and a transsexual who fashions himself in a lesbian feminist image. With the latter, his masculinity comes through, although it may not be recognized as such. Hines especially points to the body language of transsexuals, where she notes subtle but perceptible differences between, for example, the way lesbians interact with other women and the way transsexuals interact with women. One specific example of this is the way a transsexual walked into a woman's restaurant with his arm around two women, one on each side, with the possessive encompassing that is characteristically masculine. Mary Daly, in explaining why this difference is perceptible, points out that the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist is able to deceptively act out the part of lesbian feminist because he is a man with a man's history. That is, he is free of many of the residues of self-hatred, self-deprecation, and self-contradiction that attend the history of women who are born with female bodies, all of which is communicated both subtly and not so subtly in gestures, body language, and the like. Thus, it is precisely because the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist is a man, and not a woman encumbered by the scars of patriarchy that are unique to a woman's personal and social history, that he can play our parts so convincingly, and apparently better than we can play them ourselves. However, in the final analysis, he can only play the part. Although the part may at times seem as, or more, plausible than the real woman, as is also the case with the male-to-constructed female transsexual who appears more feminine than most feminine women. What is also typically masculine, in the case of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist, is the appropriation of women's minds, convictions of feminism, and sexuality. One of the definitions of male, as related in Webster's, is designed for fitting into a corresponding hollow part. This, of course, means much more than the literal signification of heterosexual intercourse. It can be taken to mean that men have been very adept at penetrating all of women's hollow spaces, of filling in the gaps and sliding into the interstices. Obviously, women who are in the process of moving out of patriarchal institutions, consciousness, and modes of living are very vulnerable and have gaps. I would imagine that it would be very difficult, for example, for Olivia Records to find a female sound engineer, and that such a person would be absolutely necessary to the survival of Olivia. But it would have been far more honest if Olivia had acknowledged the maleness of Sandy Stone and perhaps the necessity, at the time, to employ a man in this role. As one woman wrote of Sandy Stone in the Olivia controversy, quote, "I feel raped when Olivia passes off Sandy, a transsexual, as a real woman. After all his male privilege, is he going to cash in on lesbian feminist culture too?" Rape, of course, is a masculinist violation of bodily integrity. All transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves. However, the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist violates women's sexuality and spirit as well. Rape, although it is usually done by force, can also be accomplished by deception. It is significant that in the case of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist, often he is able to gain entrance and a dominant position in women's spaces because the women involved do not know that he is a transsexual, and he does not happen to mention it. The question of deception must also be raised in the context of how transsexuals who claim to be lesbian feminists obtain surgery in the first place. Since all transsexuals have to pass as feminine in order to qualify for surgery, so-called lesbian feminist transsexuals either had to lie to the therapists and doctors, or they had a conversion experience after surgery. I am highly dubious of such conversions, and the other alternative, deception, raises serious problems, of course. Deception reaches a tragic point for all concerned if transsexuals become lesbian feminists because they regret what they have done and cannot back off from the effects of irreversible surgery, for example, castration. Thus, they revert to masculinity, but not male body appearance, by becoming the man within the woman, and more within the woman's community, getting back their maleness in the most insidious way by seducing the spirits and sexuality of women who do not relate to men. Because transsexuals have lost their physical members, does not mean that they have lost their ability to penetrate women, women's mind, women's space, women's sexuality. Transsexuals merely cut off the most obvious means of invading women so that they seem non-invasive. However, as Mary Daly has remarked, in the case of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminists, their whole presence becomes a member, invading women's presence and dividing us more from each other. Furthermore, the deceptiveness of men, without members, that is, castrated men or eunuchs, has historical precedent. There is a long tradition of eunuchs who are used by rulers, heads of state, and magistrates as keepers of women. Eunuchs were supervisors of the harem in Islam and wardens of women's apartments in many royal households. In fact, the word eunuch, from the Greek eunuchos, literally means keeper of the bed. Eunuchs were men that other more powerful men used to keep women in place. By fulfilling this role, eunuchs also succeeded in winning the confidence of the ruler and securing important and influential positions. Moreover, the word eunuch is also related to the word scheme. Eunuchs schemed to obtain political power. In Mesopotamia, many eunuchs became royal officers and managers of palaces, and others emerge on the pages of history as important and often virile figures. Some were famous warriors and statesmen, as well as scholars. One finds eunuchs associated with temples dedicated to the goddesses from at least 2000 BC until well into the Roman period. In fact, the earliest mention of eunuchs is in connection with the Minoan civilization of Crete, which was a transitional period from an earlier gynocentric society. It thus appears that eunuchs, to some extent, always attached themselves to women's spaces, and most frequently were used to supervise women's freedom of movement and to harness women's self-centeredness and self-government. It is stated that entree into every political circle was possible for eunuchs even if barred to other men. Will the acceptance of transsexually constructed lesbian feminists who have lost only their outward appendages of physical masculinity lead to the containment and control of lesbian feminists? Will every lesbian feminist space become a harem? Like eunuchs, transsexuals have gained prominent and dominant access to feminist political circles, barred to other men. Just because transsexually constructed lesbian feminists are not only castrated men, but have also acquired artifacts of a woman's body and spirit, does not mean that they are unmen, and that they cannot be used as keepers of women-identified women, when the real men, the rulers of patriarchy, decide that the women's movement, used here as both noun and verb, should be controlled and contained. In this way, they too can rise in the kingdoms of the fathers. The political implications of historical eunuchism and its potential for female control should not be lost upon women-identified women. Mythic dimensions of transsexualism. Transsexuals are living and acting out a very ancient myth, that of single parenthood by the father. This myth was prevalent in many religious traditions, including the Jewish, Greek, and Christian. Eve was born of Adam, Dionysus and Athena were born of Zeus, and Jesus was generated by God the Father in his godly birth. Mary was a mere receptacle used to conform Jesus to earthly birth standards. When this myth is put into the context of transsexualism, the deeper dimensions of how transsexually constructed lesbian feminists reinforce patriarchy can be perceived. Simone de Beauvoir has remarked that, quote, "If woman did not exist, men would have invented her. They did invent her, but she exists also apart from their inventiveness." Men, of course, invented the feminine, and in this sense it could be said that all women who conform to this invention are transsexuals, fashioned according to man's image. Lesbian feminists exist apart from man's inventiveness, and the political and personal ideals of lesbian feminism have constituted a complete rebellion against the man-made invention of woman, and a context in which women begin to create ourselves in our own image. Thus, the transsexual who claims to be a lesbian feminist seems to be the man who creates himself in woman's image. This, however, is deceptive. For note that he still is created in man's image, since he is essentially a child of the father, in this case the medical fathers, renouncing his mothered birth. Mary Daly has written at length in her most recent work, Gynecology, the Metaethics of Radical Feminism, about the myth of Dionysus. She also cites various versions of the myth along with some scholarly commentaries on it. These can shed much light on the mythic implications of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist. First of all, Philip Slater points out the very interesting fact that, quote, "Instead of seeking distance from or mastery over the mother, the Dionysian position incorporates her," unquote. In the most popular version of the myth, Semele, the mother of Dionysus, while pregnant with him, is struck by Zeus with a thunderbolt and is thus consumed. Hermes saves the 6-month fetal Dionysus, sews him up in Zeus's thigh, and after 3 more months Zeus births him. Thus Zeus exterminates the woman and bears his own son, and we have single-parent fatherhood, red motherhood. Moreover, Jane Harrison has pointed out that, quote, "The word Dionysus means not son of Zeus, but rather Zeus young man, i.e. Zeus in his young form," unquote. Thus, Dionysus is his own father, red mother, and births himself into existence. Whether we are talking about being born of the father or the self, son, which is the myth we are one and the same person, as in the Christian Trinity, we are still talking about male mothering. At this level of analysis, it might seem that what men really envy is women's biological ability to procreate. Transsexuals illustrate one way in which men do this, by acquiring the artifacts of female biology. Even though they cannot give birth, they acquire the organs that are representative of this female power. However, it is the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist who illustrates that much more is desired than female biology, that much more is at stake than literal womb envy. He shows that female biology, whether exercised in giving birth or simply by virtue of its existence, is representative of female creativity on a profound mythic level. Thus, the creative power that is associated with female biology is not envied primarily because it is able to give birth physically, but because it is multidimensional, bearing culture, harmony, and true inventiveness. The transsexually constructed lesbian feminist feeds off women's true energy source, i.e., her woman-identified self. It is he who recognizes that if female spirit, mind, creativity, and sexuality exist anywhere in a powerful way, it is here among lesbian feminists. I am not saying that the lesbian feminist is the only self and woman-identified woman. What I mean to express is that lesbianism feminism signals a total giving of women's energy to women, and that it is this total woman-identified energy that the transsexual who claims to be a lesbian feminist wants for himself. It is understandable that if men want to become women to obtain female creativity, then they will also want to assimilate those women who have withdrawn their energies from men at the most intimate and emotional levels. This is of course not the usual way in which lesbian living has been harnessed. Most often, lesbian existence is simply not acknowledged, as evidenced in the laws against homosexuality, which legislate against male homosexuals but not lesbians. It has been simply assumed that all women relate to men, and that women need men to survive. Furthermore, the mere labeling of a woman as lesbian has been enough to keep lesbian living harnessed, or at best in the closet. Lesbian is the word, the label, the condition that holds women in line. When a woman hears this word tossed her way, she knows that she has crossed the terrible boundary of her sex role. Whereas the lesbian feminist crosses the boundary of her patriarchally imposed sex role, the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist is a boundary violator. This violation is also profoundly mythic, for as Norman O. Brown writes of Dionysus, he as the, quote, mad god who breaks down boundaries, unquote. Thus, exhibiting qualities that are usually associated with femininity, he appeared to be the opposite of the masculine Apollo. While the supermasculine Apollo overtly oppresses / destroys with his contrived boundaries / hierarchy / rules / roles, the feminine Dionysus blurs the senses, seduces, confuses his victims, drugging them into complicity, offering them his heart as a love potion that poisons. It is, however, the feminist Dionysus who appears in the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist. But he blurs the senses, seduces, and confuses in much the same way as the feminine Dionysus. He not only violates the boundaries of women's bodies, but of our minds and spirits. What is more tragic, however, is that he is able to make women break down our boundaries of self-definition. Elizabeth Rose, in a letter in response to my article in Chrysalis, Transsexualism, the Ultimate Homage to Sex Role Power, illustrates well this tendency of feminists to be seduced by a Dionysian boundary violation. Raymond's article encourages us to set our bottom line about whom we will allow the privilege of self-definition. I am upset that a magazine of women's culture is basically encouraging the elitist / separatist attitude that self-definition is subject to the scrutiny and judgments of those who, in the name of political purity, claim the power to define who is allowed entry into the feminist community, and now who is or who is not female. Rose would encourage us to set no boundaries by employing the analogy of how boundaries have been used oppressively against lesbians in the past or present. Rose says, there are so many painful parallels between how the world has treated strong women and lesbians and how Raymond and others categorize and discount transsexuals. But the analogy is false. The boundaries that have been used and are used against lesbians are the boundaries of the fathers, the contrived Apollonian boundaries, such as the false divisions of fields of knowledge and the splits between mind and heart. But in this process we do not become swallowed up in male-centered, Dionysian, confusion. Hags find and define our own boundaries, our own definitions. Radical feminist living on the boundary means this moving, self-centering boundary definition. As we move, we mark our own territory. Rose and other women who have been confused / seduced by a Dionysian transsexually constructed lesbian feminist boundary violation would have us believe that all boundaries are oppressive. Yet if feminists cannot agree on the boundaries of what constitutes femaleness, then what can we hope to agree on? The Dionysian final solution, as Daly points out, produces confusion in women. inability to distinguish the female self and her process from the male-made masquerade. It encourages the leveling of genuine boundaries of self-preservation and self-centering. The seduction of lesbian feminists. It is not hard to understand why transsexuals want to become lesbian feminists. They indeed have discovered where strong female energy exists and want to capture it. It is more difficult to understand why so many feminists are so ready to accept men, in this case castrated men, into their most intimate circles. Certainly Dionysian confusion about the erasure of all boundaries is one reason that appeals to the liberal mind and masquerades as sympathy for all oppressed groups. Women who believe this, however, fail to see that such liberalism is repressive, and that it can only favor and fortify the possession of women by men. These women also fail to recognize that accepting transsexuals into the feminist community is only another rather unique variation on the age-old theme of women nurturing men, providing them with a safe haven, and finally giving them our best energies. The question arises, are women who accept transsexuals as lesbian feminists expressing gratitude on some level to those men who are finally willing to join women and pay for their male privilege with their balls? Gratitude is a quality exhibited by an oppressed group when they think that some in the class of oppressors have finally relinquished their benefits to join them. But of course, it is doubtful that transsexuals actually give up their male privilege. As one woman puts it, a man who decides to call himself a feminist is not giving up his privilege. He is simply using it in a more insidious way. Furthermore, a man who decides to call himself a lesbian feminist is getting a lot. The transsexually constructed lesbian feminist is the man who indeed gets to be the man in an exclusive women's club to which he would have otherwise no access. Women who think that these men are giving up male privilege seem to be naive about the sophisticated ways in which it is possible for men to co-opt women's energy, time, space, and sexuality. Transsexually constructed lesbian feminists may be the first men to realize that if you can't fight 'em, join 'em. In a short story entitled The Women's Restaurant by T.C. Boyle, which appeared recently in Penthouse, this point is well made. The story begins by setting the scene in and around Grace and Ruby's restaurant, and it is written from the point of view of the voyeuristic narrator. Quote, "It is a women's restaurant. Men are not permitted. What goes on there, precisely, no man knows. I am a man. I am burning to find out." Unquote. The narrator then proceeds to caricature Grace and Ruby as butch and femme, as well as to relate his several attempts to gain entrance. After 2 unsuccessful endeavors, he goes to a department store, buys a pink polyester pantsuit, a bra, pantyhose, and cosmetics, with which he makes himself up to pass as a woman. He gains entrance and is able to experience what he has been missing. Here I was, embosomed in the very nave, the very umphalos of furtive femininity, a prized patron of the women's restaurant, a member, privy to its innermost secrets. There they were, women, chewing, drinking, digesting, chatting, giggling, crossing and uncrossing their legs, shoes off, feet up, smoking cigarettes, flashing silverware, tapping time to the music. Women among women. I bathed in their soft chatter, birdsong, the laughter like falling coils of hair. I lit a cigarette and grinned. No more fairy book hero thoughts of rescuing Ruby. Oh no, this was paradise. Having drunk 6 tequila sunrises and a carafe of dinner wine, the male intruder/narrator finds it necessary to relieve himself, but forgets to sit down when he urinates in the restroom, at which point he is discovered by Grace. The story ends with his savoring of the triumph of temporary infiltration and a plan for permanent invasion. I have penetrated the women's restaurant, yes, but in actuality it was little more than a rape. I am not satisfied. The obsession grows in me, pregnant, swelling, insatiable with the first taste of fulfillment. Before I am through, I will drink it to satiety. I have plans. The next time I walk through those curtain doors at Grace and Ruby's, there will be no dissimulation. There are surgeons who can assure it. That this story appeared in Penthouse is no surprise. It is obvious that its editors thought it would be of interest to their readers, whether budding or closet transsexuals. In spite of the ludicrous details and caricatures, one can see that the narrator was primarily attracted to the woman-centeredness of the restaurant. Women among women, this is paradise. Such an attitude is representative of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist who indeed gets his paradise because there were surgeons who could assure it. Ironically, the would-be transsexual narrator of the story says that the next time he walks through the doors there will be no dissimulation. Transsexualism, however, is dissimulation. As I have shown previously, to not acknowledge the fact that one is transsexual in a women's space is indeed deception. Finally, penetrating the women's restaurant was little more than a rape. Little more than a rape indeed. What little more is there to such an act, unless it is the total rape of our feminist identities, minds, and convictions? The sexually constructed lesbian feminist, having castrated himself, turns his whole body and behavior into a phallus that can rape in many ways, all the time. In this sense, he performs total rape, while also functioning totally against women's will to lesbian feminism. We have seen 3 reasons why lesbian feminists are seduced into accepting transsexuals: liberalism, gratitude, and naivete. There is yet another reason, one that can be perhaps best described as the last remnants of male identification. This is a complex phenomenon, which has various ingredients. On the one hand, there is the fear of the label man-hater. Are women who are so accepting of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist trying to prove to themselves that a lesbian feminist, she who has been called the ultimate man-hater, is really not a man-hater at all? As Adrienne Rich has pointed out, one way of avoiding that feared label and of allowing oneself to accept men is to accept those men who have given up the supposed ultimate possession of manhood in a patriarchal society by self-castration. On the other hand, there is the second component to this last remnant of male identification, i.e. attraction to masculine presence. As Pat Hines has suggested, there is an apparent similarity between a strong woman-identified self and a transsexual who fashions himself in a lesbian image. Because there is an apparent similarity, some lesbian feminists may allow themselves to express the residues of their buried attraction to men or to masculine presence, while pretending to themselves that transsexually constructed lesbian feminists are really women. This allows women to do 2 things: to express that attraction, yet also to decide themselves. Self-definition. One of the most constraining questions that transsexuals, and in particular transsexually constructed lesbian feminists, pose is the question of self-definition. Who is a woman? Who is a lesbian feminist? But of course, they pose the question on their terms, and we are faced with answering it. Men have always made such questions of major concern, and this question, in true phallic fashion, is thrust upon us. How many women students writing on such a feeble feminist topic as "should women be truck drivers, engineers, steam shovel operators?" and the like, have had their male professors scribble in the margins, "But what are the real differences between men and women?" Men, of course, have defined the supposed differences that have kept women out of such jobs and professions, and feminists have spent much energy demonstrating how these differences, if indeed they do exist, are primarily the result of socialization. Yet there are differences, and some feminists have come to realize that those differences are important, whether they spring from socialization, from biology, or from the total history of existing as a woman in a patriarchal society. The point is, however, that the origin of these differences is probably not the important question, and we shall perhaps never know the total answer to it. Yet we are forced back into trying to answer it again and again. A parallel is the abortion issue, which can also be noted in this context. The key question asked by men for centuries is, when does life begin? This question is posed in men's terms and on their turf, and is essentially unanswerable. Women torture themselves trying to answer it, and thus do not assert or even develop their own questions about abortion. Transsexuals and transsexually constructed lesbian feminists drag us back to answering such old questions by asking them in a new way, and thus feminists debate and divide because we keep focusing on patriarchal questions of who is a woman and who is a lesbian feminist. It is important for us to realize that these may well be non-questions, and that the only answer we can give to them is that we know who we are. We know that we are women who are born with female chromosomes and anatomy, and that whether or not we were socialized to be so-called normal women, patriarchy has treated and will treat us like women. Transsexuals have not had this same history. No man can have the history of being born and located in this culture as a woman. He can have the history of wishing to be a woman and of acting like a woman, but this gender experience is that of a transsexual, not of a woman. Surgery may confer the artifacts of outward and inward female organs, but it cannot confer the history of being born a woman in this society. What of persons born with ambiguous sex organs or chromosomal anomalies that place them in a biologically intersexual situation? It must be noted that practically all of them are altered shortly after birth to become anatomically male or female and are reared in accordance with the societal gender identity and role that accompanies their bodies. Persons whose sexual ambiguity is discovered later are altered in the direction of what their gender rearing has been, masculine or feminine, up to that point. Thus, those who are altered shortly after birth have the history of being practically born as male or female, and those who are altered later in life have their bodies surgically conformed to their history. When and if they do undergo surgical change, they do not become the opposite sex after a long history of functioning and being treated differently. Although popular literature on transsexualism implies that nature has made mistakes with transsexuals, it is really society that has made the mistake by producing conditions that create the transsexual body-mind split. While intersex people are born with chromosomal or hormonal anomalies, which can be linked up with certain biological malfunctions, transsexualism is not of this order. The language of nature makes mistakes only serves to confuse and distort the issue, taking the focus off the social system, which is actively oppressive. It succeeds in blaming an amorphous nature that is made to seem oppressive and is conveniently amenable to direct control/manipulation by the instruments of hormones and surgery. In speaking of the importance of history for self-definition, two questions must be asked. Should a person want to change his or her personal and social history? And if so, how should one change that history in the most honest and integral way? In answer to the first question, anyone who has lived in a patriarchal society has to change personal and social history in order to be a self. History cannot be allowed to determine the boundaries, life, and location of the self. We should be change agents of our own history. Women who are feminists obviously wish to change parts of their history as women in this society. Some men who are honestly dealing with feminist questions wish to change their history as men, and transsexuals wish to change their history of wanting to be women. In stressing the importance of female history for female self-definition, I am not advocating a static view of such history. What is more important, however, is how one changes personal history in the most honest and integral way, if one wants to break down sex role oppression. Should non-transsexual men who wish to fight sexism take on the identity of women and/or lesbian feminists while keeping their male anatomy intact? Why should castrated men take on these identities and self-definitions and be applauded for doing so? To what extent would concerned blacks accept whites who had undergone medicalized changes in skin color and in the process claim that they not only had a black body but a black soul? Can a transsexual assume the self-definition of lesbian feminist just because he wants to? Or does this particular self-definition proceed from certain conditions endemic to female biology and history? Women take on the self-definition of feminist and/or lesbian because that definition truly proceeds from not only the chromosomal fact of being born XX, but also from the whole history of what being born with those chromosomes means in this society. Transsexuals would be more honest if they dealt with their specific form of gender agony that inclines them to want a transsexual operation. This gender agony proceeds from the chromosomal fact of being born XY and wishing that one were born XX, and from the particular life history that produced such distress. The place to deal with that problem, however, is not the women's community. The place to confront and solve it is among transsexuals themselves. One should be able to make choices about who one wants to be. But should one be able to make any choice? Should a white person attempt to become black, for example? The question is a moral one, which asks basically about the rightness of the choice, not the possibility of it. Should persons be able to make choices that disguise certain facets of our existence from others who have a right to know? Choices that feed off others' energies and reinforce oppression? Jill Johnson has commented that many women are dedicated to working for the reconstructed man. This usually means women gently or strongly prodding their significant men into androgynous behavior and action. Women who accept transsexually constructed lesbian feminists say that these men are truly reconstructed in the most basic sense that women could hope for, i.e., they have paid with their balls to fight against sexism. Ultimately, however, the reconstructed man becomes the reconstructed woman, who obviously considers himself equal to and a peer of genetic women in terms of his womanhood. One transsexual openly expressed that he felt male-to-constructed female transsexuals surpassed genetic women. Genetic women cannot possess the very special courage, brilliance, sensitivity, and compassion and overview that derives from the transsexual experience. Free from the chains of menstruation and childbearing, transsexual women are obviously far superior to Jennies in many ways. Genetic women are becoming quite obsolete, which is obvious, and the future belongs to transsexual women. We know this, and perhaps some of you suspect it. All you have left is your ability to bear children, and in a world which will groan to feed 6 billion by the year 2000, that's a negative asset. Ultimately, women must ask if transsexually constructed lesbian feminists are our peers. Are they equal to us? Questions of equality often center on proportional equality, such as equal pay for equal work, or equal rights to health care. I do not mean equal in this sense. Rather, I use equality to mean like in quality, nature, or status, and capable of meeting the requirements of a situation or a task. In these senses, transsexuals are not equal to women and are not our peers. They are neither equal in quality, nature, or status, nor are they capable of meeting the requirements of the situation of women who have spent their whole lives as women. Jill Johnston has written of lesbian feminism, "The essence of the new political definition is peer grouping. Women and men are not peers, and many people seriously doubt whether we ever were or if we ever could be. Transsexuals are not our peers by virtue of their history." It is perhaps our mistrust of men as the biological aggressor which keeps bringing us back to the political necessity of power of peer grouping. Although we are still virtually powerless, it is only by constantly adhering to this difficult principle of the power inherent in natural peers — men after all have demonstrated the success of this principle very well — that women will eventually achieve an autonomous existence. The transsexual does not display the usual phallic aggression. Instead, he violates women's bodies by taking on the artifactual female organs for himself. The transsexually constructed lesbian feminist becomes a psychological and social aggressor as well. Transsexually constructed lesbian feminists challenge women's preserves of autonomous existence. Their existence within the women's community basically attests to the ethic that women should not live without men, or without the reconstructed man. How feminists assess and meet this challenge will affect the future of our genuine movement, self-definition, and power of being. In the final analysis, transsexually constructed lesbian feminists are in the same tradition as the man-made, made-up lesbians of the Playboy centerfolds. Every so often, Playboy and similar magazines feature a Sappho pictorial. Recently, male photographers have entered the book market by portraying pseudo-lesbians in all sorts of positions, clothing, and contexts that could only be fantasized by a male mind. In short, the manner in which women are depicted in these photographs mimics the poses of men pawing women. Men produce lesbian love the way they want it to be and according to their own canons of what they think it should be. Transsexually constructed lesbian feminists are in this tradition of pseudo-lesbian propaganda. Both the Playboy pseudo-lesbian and the transsexual pseudo-lesbian spread the correct, read male-defined, image of the lesbian, which in turn filters into public consciousness through the mass media as truth. By thus mutilating the true self-definition of the lesbian, men mold her image/reality according to their own. As Lisa Buck has commented, transsexualism is truly their word made flesh. Transsexually constructed lesbian feminists attempt to function as image makers of the lesbian feminist, not only for the public at large, but also for the women's community. Their masquerade of the lesbian filters into women's consciousness through the feminist media as the real thing. The ultimate tragedy of such a parody is that the reality and self-definition of lesbian feminists becomes mutilated in women themselves. Lesbian feminists who accept transsexually constructed lesbian feminists as other selves are mutilating their own reality. The various breeds of women that medical science can create are endless. There are the women who are hormonally hooked on continuous doses of estrogen replacement therapy. ERT supposedly will secure for them a new life of eternal femininity. They are the hysterectomized women, purified of their potentially lethal organs for prophylactic purposes. Finally, there is the she-male, the male-to-constructed female transsexual, and the offshoot of this breed is the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist. What all of these events point to is the particularly instrumental role that medicine has played in the control of deviant or potentially deviant women. The transsexual empire is ultimately a medical empire, based on a patriarchal medical model. This medical model has provided a sacred canopy of legitimations for transsexual treatment and surgery. In the name of therapy, it has medicalized moral and social questions of sex role oppression, thereby erasing their deepest meaning.